a little bit more. I'm from Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada, from that very tip of the province there. I live in a little town called Pooch Cove, and I want to acknowledge that here in Canada, we acknowledge the land, the Indigenous lands that we are on, and so I'd like to acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands, primarily of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq here on the island. But I also like to recognize the Innu, the Inuit, and as the original peoples of Newfoundland and Labrador. So here I am in St. John's, and you are there in Scotland at 3,450 kilometers. And I am happy to say that in our province, we have a grand total of 2 active cases of COVID right now. So people are pretty happy about that, but we still live under a lot of restrictions. This is my backyard. So the ocean that connects us is very close to me. I hike this most mornings, and it's a beautiful place to be. This is the season of blueberries here, and I go out through acres of wild blueberries, and it's one of my favorite pastimes. This is the city of St. John's, where Memorial University is. And here is the university and the office that I work in. And here is a picture of my 2 sons back in the early 2000s. And I include them in my presentations often because they are 2 young men that I am indebted to for my first visceral experience of what it feels like to know that when policy kicks in, people get kicked out. And I'll share a little bit more about that in a minute. But I believe that we are hungry. We are gathered here today because we are all hungry to deepen our understanding of what it means to live more justly, to walk more humbly, and to trust and grow as human beings in this incredible world we have been gifted with. In the words of Paulo Freire, our vocation is to become more fully human. And I want to acknowledge that my learning has come from many leaders in the field: Kay Pranis, Howard Zehr, Catherine Evans, and much more recently, Indigenous leaders and Black and people of color who are speaking boldly about injustices. So when policy kicks in, people get kicked out. And I want to just start with 3 stories. Story number 1, my story. In 1999, there was the Columbine and Tabor shootings, school shootings. And there was an incredible reactive response. So Columbine in the United States, Colorado, and Tabor a couple months later in Alberta, Canada. There was an incredibly reactive response globally, I believe, where we started to think that students were capable of killing. And so zero tolerance policies were quickly written and applied in all schools. And the school that I was in and my sons were in also rewrote policy, and zero tolerance was implemented quickly, in spite of the fact that we had a peacemaker program that was working very well with very few incidents of aggressiveness. Yet we allowed ourselves to be driven by fear and an ability and that we could no longer think for ourselves. And there was a rise in suspensions. And our boys who were in grade 5 and 7 at the time, they were rambunctious, and along with a number of their peers, it didn't take long before they had been suspended multiple times. So all of our children were seen as having potential to harm and to be harmed, and that they needed to be controlled. There was no opportunity for them to make things right, no opportunity for us to hear the perspectives of others. We were shut out as parents, other than to tell our sons that the school was just in sending them home. Now, we are beyond this now, of course. That's 20 years ago, isn't it? Zero tolerance, we understand, doesn't work. But do we really? Or have we just shifted things and called them by a different name? And I talk about, and I give the example of in 2016 in Toronto, a 6-year-old Black girl had her hands and feet handcuffed together by school police as she waited for her mother to come and pick her up. This in a district that had been implementing restorative justice for a time. Story number 2. Last year in Newfoundland and Labrador, a foster mother who for well over a year was mom to 3 Turkish-speaking Middle Eastern adolescents had her teens confide in her that students in the school they were going to were planning to attack a teacher, that they had weapons at school. And they also told stories of self-harm and how they had been encouraged to harm themselves. The mother went to the school to talk to the administrator, and the administrator said, "Thank you very much. We'll take it from here." She waited to hear a day to see if anything would happen, and she didn't hear anything. And she called the school, and the administrator said, "Sorry, ma'am, you are not the official guardian. We can only communicate with the girl's social worker." She reached out to me. I then went to the director of schools, concerned. I shared the story. He too was concerned, and I thought he heard me. He encouraged me to have the parent call him, and she did, and he said, "Thank you very much." When we asked for an update, he said, "Sorry, we can't speak to you about this. It has to do with privacy and policy." We asked for a restorative justice response, circles of dialogue, and then it was Christmas holidays. I was shut out. The parent was never brought in to understand the responses or updated in any way. When policy kicks in, people get kicked out. And then last week in Newfoundland and Labrador, a group of girls in a mall gathered together and swarmed a couple of girls. They were encircled by a large group of boys. It was videoed. One girl was pushed to the ground and kicked in the head. Suspensions were served immediately. But our safe and inclusive itinerants, and we've made progress in our province with restorative justice, but it's not yet in any policies. And we're able to get a restorative justice circle for the girls who had been harmed, but the girl who had been charged with causing the harm, because it was before the courts, is not allowed to be part of that circle. Now, this is not to leave out the rise in schools and student suspensions and expulsions last year in a province that is working towards more relational ways of being. And I think if we all stop for a moment, I think we can all talk about and think about our own experiences of when policy kicks in, people get kicked out. Regardless of what comes to mind, the reality in most of our jurisdictions at this point in time globally still remains that when policy kicks in, people get kicked out. Because in general, we have not let the essence of restorative justice influence the policy and our institutional structures to the point it needs to. Unless policy embraces the heart of restorative justice, it is likely that the way we are engaging with restorative justice is perpetuating harm. So to illustrate this, at this time in history, we need to listen deeply to the experiences of restorative justice advocates who are part of marginalized groups, the Black, Indigenous, people of color. We need to hear their frustration. I think many of you know of Colorizing Restorative Justice, which was just recently released, and Fania Davis's little book of Race and Restorative Justice. Both of these books point significantly to the gaps in what is going on in the field. And just a couple of recent research papers, Davison, Penner, and Penner say restorative justice practices had differential, in terms of the impact of restorative justice in schools, they had differential effects between racial groups, with white students benefiting the most from restorative justice. Now, these findings suggest that while the overall effects of restorative justice are promising, these practices may unintentionally widen the racial disproportionality in school discipline they are instituted to mitigate. Then Andrea Joseph, in her doctoral research, says the discipline gap remained, leaving Black males 1.7 more times more likely and Black females 1.3 times more likely to be suspended compared to all other students. A contributing factor to this racial disproportionality was and I can't see this, was the race-neglected implementation of restorative justice. And then Lustig says, disproportionality prevails in schools that use restorative practices. This is sobering research in terms of how we are moving forward with restorative justice. So what do we need to understand about restorative justice education? Well, implementing restorative justice education is an experience of the proverbial square peg and round hole syndrome. We like to think of restorative justice as the round peg in the square hole. And it seems more possible to have circles fit into square holes. And perhaps this is where the issue lies. Do we, who are restorative justice advocates, try to exist in the context of our existing structures without expecting them to be transformed? And perhaps this cartoon highlights this at the student experience level. So specific to the Scottish context, I'd refer you to the work of Kristen Reimer, which many of you, I think, know, in her book, Adult Intentions and Student Perceptions, where she did a comparative study between a school in Scotland and a school in Alberta, Canada, and the differences that she discovered in terms of how restorative justice is being used to control and to either to control or to engage. So she exposes this tension in the field very well. And in doing a comparative study, she comes to significant insights. And one key thing is how she differentiates between affirmative restorative justice versus transformative restorative justice, where affirmative restorative justice focuses on individual behavior without challenging the systemic roots of injustice, and transformative restorative justice being about a radical paradigm shift addressing societal injustices and power imbalances. So restorative justice as a worldview. So affirmative restorative justice uses restorative justice to control. Transformative uses it to transform. In her article that just came out a couple of weeks ago, she changes the terminology about, and she differentiates between behavior management restorative justice and comprehensive restorative justice. And in that article, she articulates that restorative justice, when it sits side by side with punitive measures, the focus was more on controlling behavior than on engaging individuals, building connections and providing consistent, meaningful ways to participate as community members. The school that she observed in Scotland, the focus was primarily on behavior management restorative justice. And that's not to say that in Scotland all the schools are doing that, or in Canada all the schools are engaging in transformative restorative justice. Not at all. But I think the two schools are a red flag for all of us to recognize what is going on in restorative justice more generally, because these two schools could have been side by side within a county in Scotland, or side by side in the city in Calgary, where she was working or researching. So I would say that just a second here, sorry. Affirmative or behavior management restorative justice is restorative justice that has not impacted policy. It is the round peg fitting in the square hole. But if comprehensive or transformative restorative justice is to happen in schools, then the school structure, the policy, the square needs to be shaped to fit the round hole of restorative justice. So what does this comprehensive restorative justice ground it in then? This has been my work from the beginning that I've been working with in a very critically reflective way for many years now. But we say the work that I do, we talk about how at the core of restorative justice, and a lot of this, the little book of restorative justice in education that Catherine Evans and myself wrote really describes this in full. But I just want to go over it very quickly, that the seed of restorative justice is how we see each other as human beings. Where humanity, human beings, every single one of us, no matter what we do, say, think, or feel, or look like, we are all worthy, we are relational, and our well-being is nurtured by one another. A comprehensive understanding of restorative justice includes primary restorative justice, where primary justice is present in social relationships when no one is wronged, when the worth of the other is placed in the forefront of our attention. And secondary restorative or secondary justice is when we address the situation where wrong and harm has occurred. So primary justice is about nurturing worth and interconnectedness, and secondary justice is about reestablishing worth and interconnectedness. So Catherine and I, Kathy Evans and I propose that restorative justice in education that's transformative has to have at its core this understanding of who we are as people. And then that has to be worked out in 3 ways in every school context. There has to be a very explicit focus on creating just and equitable learning environments, nurturing healthy relationships, repairing harm, and transforming conflict. So that's just kind of a core of what we've been how we understand a transformative way of restorative justice. More recently, actually last week, I finished a chapter called Between Wholeness and Restoration, where I look at what is the theory, what is the philosophy about what is broken, how do we move, what is being restored. And Bill Bigelow in Rethinking Schools published this article that I think provides great insight. Wholeness is when we have a stand at that precipice of being free, choosing to be free to harm, or choose to work for freedom from harm. And Bigelow explains how in the United States right now, the dominant society is working very hard to protect their freedom to cause harm for their survival, for their benefit, whereas marginalized communities are always working to create communities free from harm. So that's just a little bit of what's at the core of restorative justice as transformation. In Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as in the Little Book of Restorative Justice, we define restorative justice education as learning that nurtures the capacity of people to engage with one another and their environments in a manner that supports and respects the inherent worth and interconnectedness of all within their environments. And we talk about ripples of relationship, where our first relationship that we have to honor is our relationship with ourself, and how that goes, that ripples outwards into all of the other relationships we have. And I'm going to now turn the focus back to our relationship with institutions and policy. So restorative justice, just to finish the definition basically, is that when something occurs that undermines the well-being of some, a space is provided for dialogue whereby the dignity of all involved and affected can be restored. So what's being restored is the dignity and humanity of people. In Newfoundland and Labrador, we have an implementation guide that's available to anybody. You can pick this up as well. And I just very quickly would say that we started our journey with restorative justice about 8 years ago, when I was working to see if the findings of my doctoral research would hold true. And that is that implementation at a grassroots level would be more sustainable than implementation from the top down. And we're still in the midst of trying to figure that out. And there's no easy answer, and there's no yes or no answer to this. I think it has to do with how do we understand the core of restorative justice. But here in Newfoundland and Labrador, 8 years ago, I did a 2-week internship with 17 educators. And at the end of that, I challenged them to take what they had learned into their schools, and that I could not understand what each of their contexts were, but they had to figure out how to move it forward if they felt so called to do it. Well, 8 years later, we have 57 schools that are engaging in some way with restorative justice, and 29% of those schools are implementing it as an approach to build and improve relationships primarily. That's encouraging to me because currently there are no directives in place or no policies in place from the district as to the implementation of restorative justice here in the province. However, the Department of Education is rewriting its Safe and Caring Schools policy, and it is grounded in a relational restorative justice approach. So we're hoping that, and that came out of that 2-week institute 8 years ago. One of the slides or one of the content that we used at that time and continue to use, that restorative justice education's focus needs to be on relationships instead of rules and behavior, people instead of policy, honoring instead of measuring, well-being instead of success, asking instead of telling. And I would draw your attention to people instead of policies. Now, we don't talk about that anymore, but we talk more about how restorative justice education has to focus on people before policy. And so I'd like to move that forward now in terms of saying, well, then how do we understand policy? What is policy? And I need to catch up on my notes here. So I would say that we need to know what policy is, how we might be accepting policy as law rather than guiding principles. So a couple of examples of that. I teach in the pre-service education program at Memorial, and many of my pre-service teachers are, when they go into a classroom, and I encourage them to set up their classroom in circle, or at least have circles, one of their comments are, but can I do this? Is it okay with the school for me to set up my classroom in a circle? Because the school rule or the school policy or the custodian says we can't. And so they feel like they need permission to change the physical structure of their classroom. Another example is when curriculum developers in the province say to educators, and I've heard this, here is the official curriculum. By law, you are required to teach this content, without helping them to understand that they are responsible for interpreting that content. And there are both oppressive and nurturing ways of doing so. And then, more simply, the 5-year-old child who comes to the school office and needs to stand on tiptoe to look over the counter. And we don't change that because we don't have the funds for structural change. When ultimately what we could say is, let's buy a step stool at least until we can change this for the child. So how do we understand what policy is? Here's a definition of policy from Devin Dodd and Hebert Boyd from 2000. A policy is a plan of action agreed to by a group of people with the power to carry it out and enforce it. And I put that before you because I think we have to be very careful when we use the term policy, when we think about policy. Do we see policy as organic, or do we see it as something that is unmovable?
You have 5 more minutes.
Okay, I think I can do it. Here we go. So, what does people before policy look like? Well, policy needs to be flexible. The adherence to policy allows for the policy to be flexible, that the context of the situation and the needs of those directly involved must be taken into account as part of that policy response. We need to accept that people created policy and that people can change policy. We have to stop trying to adapt restorative justice to our current understanding of what a policy is. We need to ask, what will make life better for this person or these people? What in the policy is getting in the way of providing for the needs of this person or these people? How do we advocate for changing that policy? And then we need to ensure that people who can influence organizational structure are present in our dialogue and conferencing circles, and we need to listen deeply. And here, I'd like us to realize that we need to, in the field of restorative justice, we need to hold ourselves to account, to be critically reflective of what it is in the field that could be reinforcing institutional policies in schools where restorative justice is getting airtime. And I put one example before us. And with all due respect to the originators of this statement, who have done much to advocate for restorative justice ways of being, with this as a core continuing principle that comes up in the literature all the time, can we see perhaps how this concept gets written into our understanding and our policies regarding restorative justice, and perhaps how it could be perpetuating harm? Read it carefully. What assumptions are being made here? There is an assumption in this statement that people in authority do not need to change, that the people in authority know better than those they serve. It's a sobering thing, and it's a sobering thing that I apply to my own work every single day. It's a sobering thing that I wake up to every day and work with fear and trepidation. We need to stop being puzzled by the reality that disproportionality is a reality still in restorative justice. Our current pandemic context, the Black Lives Movement, Indigenous, non-Indigenous relationships, which is a big thing here in Canada. Here's a statement that actually comes out in colorizing restorative justice as well. Colonization, if you don't address it, it doesn't go away. It just reinvents itself into a form that is palatable for the current generation. And I think we need to ask ourselves this question: how is restorative justice education being used to recolonize, to oppress? What do we need to do? We need to work to reshape our institutions, and we need to be aware that when we are compromising the principles and practices of restorative justice education to fit into the established institutional structures, we are using policy in a way that will actually cause further harm. A recent new learning from an Indigenous elder here in Canada, he says, you don't measure progress in inches and feet exclusively. You actually measure progress in degrees. The first thing you need to do when you change is you need to point your head in a different direction before you've taken a single step. And so I'd like to conclude by just saying, let's not underestimate the role and the responsibility we have as classroom teachers, as administrators, as researchers at this time in history. You and I are called this day to challenge structural oppression in our families, in our personal lives, in our classrooms, in our schools, in our communities, in our nations. When policy kicks in and people still get kicked out, especially in contexts where restorative justice is supposed to be part of the culture. We need to understand that restorative justice is not doing what we think it should be. When policy kicks in, it should create opportunities for connection and healing. Policy needs to be grounded in responsiveness to the needs of the people we are working with. Our policies need to be flexible so they enrich the lives of the people we live with. We currently live in a world where it's been made very, very clear that some lives matter more than others, that our organizational structures are headed up primarily by white, Eurocentric, privileged people eager to feel good about what we do. Am I noticing that when policy kicks in, people get kicked out? Then it is my responsibility to do something about it. And I invite you all to share in that responsibility with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. For the recording, since we missed a little bit of the beginning, this was Professor Dorothy Vandering from Canada. Thank you so much. Without further ado, we'll pass to Maya Gelin. She's the director of the program for restorative approaches and mediation in education in Finland, as well as a mediator specializing in cases in schools, among others. So Maya, the floor is yours.
Okay. Do you see my slide?
No, not just.
Oh, okay, I tried once more. Well.
While Maya is preparing her slides, I remind everyone that if you have questions for our speakers, you're very welcome to put them in the chat. And Steve and Jenny and I will pass them on to the speakers afterwards. We have to stay muted just so that we can just hear the speakers today. Maya, are you okay?
Oh, no, well, I have to do it again. I don't know why it doesn't work. I just open this once more.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then I try once more. Here we are. Now I try to share. Here. So now you see the slide.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. So I go on with that.
Mute myself.
Okay, my name is Maya Gelin. I come from Finland, from Finnish Forum for Mediation. I do not have such a fine pictures of Finland or Finnish nature like Dorothy had, but I'm going straight to the issue I'm telling about. So actually, I think it's more about the kind of case study what we have been doing in Nordic countries. It's a little bit different culture of education here in Finland and in Nordic countries. So it's another perspective that I'm sharing for you. First of all, I come from the Finnish Forum for Mediation, which is a NGO, and the non-profit NGO that is increasing the understanding of restorative justice and the use of mediation in every level of our society. And I work in the Verso program. Is the program that is it is for implementing restorative approach to a field of education in Finland. So this work I have been doing now over 20 years. As you can see, we are talking about mediation, not so much about restorative practices. And why we do it is that we have a long history in Nordic countries about mediation services and mediation practices. So when we are talking about restorative justice, the mediation is connected with that as a practice of kind of daily practice or in our society, and it's kind of connected to a restorative justice in many levels, but not in all. In this picture, you can see the mediation services that are available in Finnish society at the moment. And if we look from the child's perspective, we can see that in learning communities, we have these school mediation systems going on, and even in daycare, we have this mediation and restorative approach actually going on, and I'm telling a little bit more about those later. But if you see the whole picture, the near community of every child, we have also the access to mediation services in many levels. We have this victim offender mediation, which has started in Finland about 40 years ago. So, and it's the free service to every citizen in Finland. In the case, mainly in the case of criminal situation, and it's more for victim and offenders. But nowadays, it's also developed more about many kind of daily disputes can be mediated by the offices of mediation, victim offender mediation. And then we have another that comes near to schools and children, street mediation, for example, if they have young people have misbehaved in, for example, in shopping malls, in their free time and so on. And then if you think about this picture to family mediation is for families that are having divorce cases. Neighborhood mediation is solving the disputes between neighborhoods and families in the same living areas, and so on and so on. So in that sense, we have to understand that in Finland, mediation is kind of the word that we use when we are talking about restorative approach. Although all these mediation systems, I think as a researchers, are not so restorative, and that's the challenge I think we have at the moment in our society, how to create and strengthen the values of restorative justice when we are doing this different kind of mediation services in our society. But here we can see how we have the situation in Finland at the moment, and if we think schools, we can see also that schools are when they are implementing restorative approach and mediation in school culture, the schools are connecting to a conflict management tradition and development in Finnish societies. So schools are not alone, but they are very deeply connected with the society in this sense. Okay, this is as a kind of background and a figure where we are in Finland at the moment, and in somehow the mediation and the schools are kind of connected with the mediation family that we have in Finland. Child-friendly justice is one of the main ideas and main aims what we have when we are increasing well-being in our society, and especially in schools and daycare. And we see that the child and childhood are valuable as such, And if we think our responsibility is to support a child and child's development regardless of what position a child has in a conflict. And this is the first premise. And the second is that we can always say no to misbehavior and a criminal action, but we never say no to a child. And the third one is that when strengthening the access and participation to restorative practices, the parties, both victims and offenders, can reach the benefits of the restorative justice and restorative approach are offering. So these are some kind of ideas that I wanted to share for you. And then about the national curriculum we have now, it's about the first time in our history in the Finnish national curriculum for basic education, the mediation and conflict management are in these plans. And we can see that in Finland, the system in schools are such that our schools are quite independent, but this national curriculum is giving a framework for every school to build up their own local curriculums. And after we have had this mediation and conflict management mentioned here in our core curriculum, it has really helped schools to start implementing also mediation and restorative approach in their schools. And so it's more and more kind of giving us permission for doing that, just like Dorothy said, that people are waiting for somehow this permission even in schools, although they could add or connect restorative justice, for example, of developing the well-being of the whole society. But how we do it, it's the thing that they are thinking about. I was very happy to know this. We work hard for the group of mediation researchers here in Finland to have this mediation mentioned in our core curriculum, and now it is there. And the next great thing was that I was asked to take part to a group that Ministry of Education and Culture had, and to find the prevention of school bullying and promoting of undisturbed condition in early childhood education, primary and secondary education. And it was also very important document that we could get out, because there were several proposals how we can strengthen the well-being of children in schools and daycare. And one of the proposals was about the strengthening the culture of mediation in the field of early education and education, increasing the use of mediation services by sharing information to kindergarten schools and educational establishment, as well as their near communities, so that mediation activities and services can be actively used in conflict situations. So I started with the idea of child-friendly justice, and now when I have been working in these groups of our decision makers, I can see that now what does child-friendly justice means in the level of schools and their daily life now. It's kind of these proposals and this core curriculum is kind of giving more tools for that, how to work for child's rights and child friendly justice in school level. And that is something that our teachers, for example, and headmasters has been asking for, not only having kind of big ideas, but having real tools how to go on with these very important tasks. So about the mediation services connecting, how they are connecting to our daily life of our school society and near society of the school. Here's a step model that I have been using many times. So what we are doing is that we are having this peer mediation systems going on in kindergartens and schools. And here you can see that what kind of cases have been mediated by trained peer mediators in schools and staff members in kindergartens. And we have the step model. It means that there is always adults' responsibility of this approach. And if for example, in peer mediation, we cannot have the good solutions so that pupils are not changing their behavior, then we can use the adult-led mediation, for example, in these kind of cases, like you can see here. And then they are mediated by the trained staff members of a school and go on. Just if we have more challenging situations where we need adults, parents, or other supportive adults, there we can use also mediation and trained, so that trained principals, for example, can mediate the situation. And here we can see then next level where we can have this connection to our victim offender mediation services. So if the school cannot manage this conflict, it's too challenging, too big to mediate in a school, then we can always contact to a local victim offender offices and go and work with the same restorative mediation process, which is very child-friendly in that way that children can learn even in the school about the mediation, and families get known about the mediation, so they have the same system even though the situation is more and more challenging. So this is what we are building up in our society. Okay, and then I go back to a school. What we are doing in schools is just that it's not about the practices only or the methods, but it's more that we are building a whole school approach. So the first thing is to strengthen the idea that in everyday life, we can strengthen relationships and learning together, and we can learn social skills and active citizenships even during the lessons. So we use the restorative circles there. And then we can use the peer mediation and adult-led mediation when needed. And then even in a challenging situation, mediation and conferencing. This is what we are doing in our schools. This is the whole picture that we are, when we are starting implementing restorative approach in the school, this is how we kind of build the new reality in our schools. So one point is that we want to access participation for all members of a school community. So every member of school community is valuable when we are starting and implementing a restorative approach. So in kindergartens, daycare, we have this staff as restorative encounters and mediators and staff, and children learn to take advantage of mediation. We use, for example, puppet shows and so on, that children can learn how to mediate and how to have a mediation when needed. And then we have the peer mediation, where students are peer mediators and adult instructors of Versa activities as instructors of Versa activities. And then in this situation, staff and students can benefit from peer mediation. And then we have system for adults so that they can deepen their understanding of restorative work and act as restorative mediators when needed. And then we have this mentoring system going on that is kind more of how we go on implementing and developing the activities of restorative approach in these schools and daycare systems. So what I did, I started to ask in my PhD research if we really have this kind of picture in our schools, that we have been trained them to start to implement. And when actually what I just show is this large picture, what we want them to implement when the schools are starting the restorative approach programs like Verso. And I went back to schools to ask if there's something left, like restorative practices or restorative approach in schools. And I did my PhD research on that. I was interested in to know if some restorative elements is there left there in the schools that have followed our program. And indeed there was. And the first thing that I find out that the restorative thinking and supporting restorative participation have strengthened an understanding of the value of each member of the community when increasing the well-being of the community. So it's more like doing together and increasing the well-being of community, not only using the methods. And the other thing was kind of professional insight that the skill of restorative encounter has freed up teachers to support pupils' ability to learn, to interact, take responsibility, and change behavior. And this was very interesting notice. And then in the end, about the restorative mediation, they saw that restorative mediation has decreased prejudice, increased understanding and responsibility, and brought respect between community members despite differing views. And these are the main findings from my PhD research. In the end, I found out that it's not about restorative practices, but it's more about restorative approach in daily profession, which creates restorative culture. And as a result of my PhD research, I found out the dimensions of restorative encounter. So what we need, we don't need only the methods or practices, but we have to change the whole culture. So what had happened in those schools that has followed the restorative values and implement restorative approach in their schools was that they had committed more and more to restorative thinking, and they have learned to take care of restorative participation, and they have learned to use restorative mediation whenever needed. And this was a part of daily life. It wasn't such that when they are doing circles or when they are doing the mediation with pupils or with adults or whatever, but it was kind of a way of living, and it was in the culture, and many of those teachers that were informants of my research told that it's like more that it's here that we are breathing. So it's the way of we are doing together and having this school's culture. So the change was amazing there in many of those schools. And I think this is the most important thing, not to start with the practice, but more to change the thinking, understanding the participation, and then use the restorative circles like mediation when needed. And that was nice to notice also that in this when this really happens, this restorative culture and restorative encounter comes as a way of being in daily life. It's giving, it's two-way process. It's giving kind of strength and the identity of a teacher as well as the identity of a pupil. So I think I'm running out of time, or I still have some.
You still have about a bit more than 5 minutes, if you want.
Oh, okay, good. Then I go back to a mediation process in Finnish school. So this is how we use mediation in our school, and as you can see, it's for all the members of the community. So we can, staff members, parents, parties of the conflict, or juvenile in schools, pupils in school can use the mediation processes. So this is very important to understand that in Finnish schools, this kind of democratic way of working together is very addressed. So that's why we are always taking children with us and pupils with us when we are starting different kind of processes. I think mediation is a special way in that sense that it is the first kind of method for conflict management where children are respected as a valuable part of the whole process, and as experts of their own life, and not only to give the responsibility for the adults, but also give the possibility to children to be heard and to affect to solutions that has been done in these conflict situations. So I'm not going into that more, but just to know this how it works in our schools. And then about the evaluation. Evaluation is an important part of developing the approach. So we need numbers and the statistics for decision makers. It's always like that. We don't have any fundings if we don't have this kind of statistics, and that's why we are collecting quite many kind of statistics about what has happened in the field of education in those schools that are following our program. And then we need experiences and tools for reflection to practitioners. So we need always to give back to those schools some more and more information and share their good practices and their experiences and so on, that they can develop their work and this whole school approach in their schools. As an example of statistics, for example, here is one kind of comparing our results of peer mediation. So you can see that this is kind of statistics we are collecting to our decision makers. And on the other hand, we have this qualitative questionnaires, how teachers, how pupils are experiencing the restorative practices and restorative approach in their school. And this is very important to start collecting this data from the very early beginning of when implementing restorative practices in school. And in the end, the learning point has been the very essential value and result of restorative approach in our schools. And I think this is the most I think this is the strongest kind of background, or how you call it, premise, why to do restorative approach and restorative practices in our schools, is to have this open this learning point and learning as a most valuable thing for our children to learn during their school years. And here is the result of one research I have done. This is from my masterpiece. When I was asked from the children that what they do learn when they use the restorative approach in their school, or do they, and here you can see the results. And this, for example, this information has been very powerful when I have been telling this in schools, but also when in different groups of decision makers, to have more and more kind of opportunities to increase the awareness of restorative practices and benefits of restorative practices in the field of education. So this is almost end, and then I want to give the last one, the idea of a peer mediator, the voice of the children. So when we are doing these questionnaires for children that are working as a peer mediators or have been as parties in a peer mediation or in circles in schools, so these kind of opinions we can get from our children, and it's nice to know this, that it brings something for the future also to our children. About restorative model, you can always read this. I think most of you know that, but restorative approach in schools is a part of European model for restorative juvenile justice. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Maya. It was great. I think we have a few questions for both of you speakers. So if Steve, can you take over?
Yep, that's right. So hi, everyone. So I'm Steve Kirkwood, a senior lecturer in social work at the University of Edinburgh, and I also co-chair the Scottish Network of Restorative Justice Researchers. So thanks very much for those fascinating presentations. I've got a few questions from the audience, which I'll just put to the speakers. So we've got the first question here from Luke Roberts for Dorothy, which is, what role does organisational culture play in mediating policy in the lived experience of restorative interventions?
repeat that, Steve?
Certainly.
What role?
Yep. What role does organizational culture play in mediating policy and the lived experience of restorative interventions?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think Maya's presentation really demonstrated well, like the intersectionality and the responsibility on from every angle, right? So, what role does organizational structure take? I think I actually believe very firmly that the directors of different organizations have a responsibility to understand how their different structures are impacting the people that they exist for, right? And so that is something that I personally find a little bit frustrating as we're working to implement restorative justice here in the province, is that there's a lot of awareness about the importance of restorative justice and relational ways of being, even at the director level, right? So there's a very significant awareness. But the number of times I hear, but we can't do that right now, or we're gonna need to study this, or we're gonna need to do this and that, and so at the end of the day, it is the directors, it is the people at the top that will be the ones that need to make the change happen. Right? So I'm not sure that I'm addressing the question completely, but I guess that's where I'm going with it, is that we cannot leave out the responsibility of the of those responsible for the organizational structure. But one thing that I am finding here in Newfoundland and Labrador is that the educators on the ground, as they engage with restorative justice and have huge success, much like what Maya is describing, that does ripple up. And there is then a demand from the bottom to the top that says, we know how to do this differently, and we need you to get some of the barriers out of the way. And that's where we're at right now in Newfoundland and Labrador. So definitely, what role does the organization hold? A very, very significant role if that actual change is going to happen, right? But that there has to be pressure that comes from the people it's serving to make that change.
Thanks very much. I've got another question here for Dorothy, which is from Jamie Buchan. He says, I was reminded by your presentation of an article by Roxana Willis about how social class can condition the responses of participants in RJ and hence lead to the reproduction of class inequalities. I was wondering if you could comment a little more on the mechanisms by which ethnic inequalities or institutional racism can be reproduced in colourblind school restorative justice. And there's another related question here from Terence Bevington. Following on from Jamie's question, he says, I'm wondering about responses to incidents of identity-based harm as a right site for a more transformative enactment of RJ in schools.
Yeah, that's the essence, and that's the challenge, I think, for the field right now, to be perfectly honest, is we need to acknowledge that there are really good things happening in our different organizations and institutions, right? But then we need to also acknowledge that we're falling far short of what we say we're doing, okay? And personally, the way that I am challenging myself in that is to listen more deeply, okay? Is to say, I don't know the answer, but I know that who I am actually contributes to perpetuating those inequalities within our systems. And so the one thing that I really love about restorative justice, when we have circle conferences, whether that's circle check-in circles or whether it's circles for harm, is that everybody's story needs to get, it is heard, right? So we can't shut out any of those stories. And my own experience in the last 6 months, I would say, though I've been on that journey for a long time around decolonizing my own way of thinking and being, is that deep listening is a way of listening. And this is in the article that Kristen and I just had published in the journal that Estelle was talking about, is that we have to understand what deep listening is. And deep listening is not just making space for people to share their stories, but when I am listening, am I listening expecting that I need to change? And that's why I bring forward the things that I do. I have experienced in the last probably 2-3 years the number of times I've heard something that has challenged me to recognize that I'm holding on to Eurocentric ways of thinking and being. So I'm going on a bit about this, but how do we stop reproducing that? We actually call each other, those of us who are dominant in the field and dominant in the culture, we challenge each other to stop and listen and not become defensive, but to say, what is really going on here? Like when I'm reading Colorizing Restorative Justice, every page I read makes me stop to go, oh my goodness, this is what we are calling restorative justice, and this is how it's being experienced. And Newfoundland and Labrador has a high indigenous population, though we're ignoring it for the most part. And it is very white and very European on the outside, right? And so right now we're not real ready for the racial conversation. But I am wondering about the conversation around ableism, around ageism, around socioeconomic status, and all of those kinds of things. I think there's that who we are as human beings is requires us to recognize that our default is to choose power over rather than creative power with. Again, it's a deep question, and thank you for the question. I don't have an answer. I just know that I believe I need to call all of us and myself to listen deeply and say, what is it that I need to change?
Thanks very much. Maya, I've got a few questions I'll come to you to now. So Luke Roberts asks, over what time frame was your research conducted to understand culture change in the schools? You're on mute, Maya.
Okay, thank you for the question. If I understood it right, I try to answer. So it was 10 years ago that we started to implement this whole school restorative approach in our schools. And 20 years ago, we started with the peer mediation. So we actually started, like Dorothy said, that we started from the bottom. We started with the children, and then little by little, our teachers and staff members of school started to understand that they want also to learn a deeper understanding of restorative approaches. And there were Belinda Hopkins that helped us to start with this journey to a restorative approach. And after a few years later, it was 2012, 2012, I started to do my research about when I started to ask if there is any restorative approach or restorative anything left in those schools. So the schools, the informants that answers to my research, as when I interviewed them, some of those had used restorative approach about 5 years, and some of those about 1 year after the trainings they have had. So in this time window, they have these experiences that they told about. And of course, there was a lot of challenges like timing and how to change the attitudes of all staff members and such things. But I just gave the kind of theoretical idea what it should be if we start implementing the whole school approach from their perspective. I don't know if I answered the question.
I've got another question for you, Maya, which is from Anna Gregory. Could you say a little bit more about peace mediation that form part of the civil society section of your opening graphic?
Yes, they're called about this international peace mediation that our politicians are mostly doing. We have actually 2 organizations, international organizations that are doing these peace mediations between different countries, for example, or nations, and that's for that.
So we've got a question for you, Maya, from Belinda Hopkins. Does the system you talked about also allow for the possibility that the adults may have also contributed to the situation, or perhaps even been responsible for upsetting a young person in the first place? Are the adults also held to account? Is there a risk that this system might reinforce the existing power imbalance?
Yeah, this is a very good question. That's why we have this different kind of levels of mediation processes and different services that are more focused on this kind of issues. So if there are adults involved in these conflicts, for example, we have this victim offender mediation systems that there are mediators that are specialized for these kind of cases to mediate and take care of, for example, these power balance things and so on. And for example, in the family mediation system, it's the same thing. That's why we have a kind of very structured training systems to mediators in Finnish society, so that all these kind of questions are taken in account when we are training our mediators. But it's also a challenge in that way that many times people are thinking that mediation is just some kind of discussion together, and then they try to do it without kind of trained people that really can take care of this specific question depending on the case. And this is a challenge that we have to work here also, because many of the mediation work is done by the voluntary people.
Okay, I'll come back to Dorothy for a question also from Belinda Hopkins, which is, it is already hard to encourage school staff to change the way they address challenging behaviour and move away from punitive responses. I have always had a radical agenda of transformation, but I have always believed that we need to start with where people are and then gradually work with them to change their whole system. Sadly, in my 25 years in this work, I have never seen this happen. So can that even be possible without big changes in the society of which each school is a part?
Belinda, thank you for that question, and your earlier question for Maya too. You know, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. it can be really disheartening, I think, and yet there's always these incredible stories of reparation and healing. I lost my train of thought on this one. I think so. So that idea of transformation, Belinda, is you cannot. I don't know if this is going to help, and I don't know if this is going to answer the question. My work has always centered around professional learning has to begin with participants taking a critical look or being able to identify what they believe about humanity. And my own perspective has been that unless professional learning provides opportunity for that kind of engagement with what's at my very core, okay, that transformation is not going to happen. And that can happen in a very short little exercise that I can do with participants, right? And for others, it takes weeks, of training, weeks of exposure. And so it can't be put into a box. So I struggle with that because many times schools want to bring me in for 3 hours or one day, and then they expect that they've done their due diligence. And I'm always hoping and praying that 2 or 3 of the participants actually have an aha moment and can move it forward. So without going back to the question, Belinda, specifically around this, I think that's why I believe this is going to take generations. The transformation, though we're seeing transformation, if we start to claim that restorative justice is embedded in our school or our district or our province, for me, that's an immediate red flag that says we have just implemented something. We have not shifted a way of thinking. And it's our Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are really making me aware of that, right? I don't know. Am I answering your question, Belinda? I'm seeing your face and you're nodding a little bit. The Zoom stuff is driving me crazy, but.
Thanks very much for that. Well, just Maya, I see you want to come in. We're just approaching the break. So Maya, if you would like to just add your comments and then we'll move on to the break.
I just shortly want to say that what we need desperately is the tools for reflection of our own work and the tools to share with the teachers that they can really do the reflection, self-reflection and reflection with the colleagues, that they are on the right path. And I really mean about the attitudes, the restorative thinking, how they use this idea of participation. What does it mean? Just as an answer to Belinda, that it really needs to go through this question about a balance of power. And me, in my research, I just found the elements of restorative participation. What really does it mean? So we have to have tools for evaluating and reflection on that. And we also need really to have a good reflection tools to reflect that, for example, in Finland, the mediation processes are really restorative because they are not always at all like that. And this is something that we, as researchers, need to go on and work on with this. It's not about to have statistics, but it's now I think it's the time to have a very good reflection tools to our people to understand and to evaluate that they are really using these restorative values.
And if I can just add quickly to that, I think that the idea of reflection is critically important, and that the implementation, though working with students can really, it can be a place to start, but there has to be an explicit awareness of how that moves to reflection on self and adult. I would be a big proponent of not thinking about restorative justice implementation with students, but only with the adults in the school and social context.
Yes.
And in the implementation guide that we've developed and that Kathy Evans has done a lot of work on, there are a number of reflection checklists that we have found to be very helpful, very, very discomforting sometimes, but helpful.
But we also need, Dorothy, to go with these schools that are starting. It's the bigger process. It's a longer process. It's not we are having one day training and then you are there. But we have a longer process like we do have in our program, follow-ups and all things like that. And that's why, for example, peer mediation systems are quite nicely working in our school. They are giving a big value to our schools because the voice of the children are rising up, and they are really working together with the teachers to develop those processes there.
Okay, thanks very much. I would like to thank Dorothy and Maya for the presentations and the great responses to the questions, and all of you for your questions. I think we maybe give silent applause or something like that, and then we all come back in just under 20 minutes at 3 o'clock UK time for the next session. Thanks very much.
So I think we'll start soon. Just to check, Chris, are you around?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I think some people have left. They might come back, but I'll let them in as we go. I did not introduce myself, and then Steve did so well himself. So I'm Estelle Zinstag, and I'm one of the co-chairs of this network. I live in Glasgow, and I currently work at the University of Oxford, but I'm soon to move here to Edinburgh Napier University. I'm a criminologist. But now I want actually to introduce Chris, who has accepted our invitation to come and talk to us. Chris has a long experience as a teacher and head teacher, and is now a trainer and consultant working with schools and children and young people services in England and Wales. Chris, you have the floor. You have half an hour. After 25 minutes, I'll interrupt you for a couple of seconds to tell you it's almost.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to start with a quotation from Twitter, which I hadn't intended to start with until I listened to Dorothy and Maya. And it says this: restorative practice is one tool out of many. It can be as useful as a hammer putting up a picture frame, or as useless as a screwdriver sawing wood. It is very often done badly. For it to be of any use, participants must be capable of feeling remorse for their actions. That quotation's from the Department for Education's behaviours are, and we'll refer to him later on, but the starting point really for me is that, and this is a very personal reflection of restorative practice in schools, is that we own, as practitioners and people working in this field, I think we own the misunderstandings within that quotation, though, and this particular gentleman's use of it is deliberate and provocative. I would say that many people, if we were to approach them about restorative practice, would share very similar views about it. And I think that there is a degree to which, when I'm thinking about the English context, we have institutionally at governmental level lots of barriers. But in terms of delivering restorative practice in schools, I think we've also got to look at a way forward, which is reflective of the context of each of the schools. So I'll take you on sort of some general ideas at the beginning of this, and then really the main part of this presentation will be just around a project in Liverpool that's been running for 5 years now, to take you through the elements of that as a model, not as the only definitive model of moving towards restorative schooling within a local authority setting. And I do that knowing that sitting behind their screens at the moment, there are many people who I've worked with and who have been inspired by, and who approach things in slightly different ways. But I can only sort of refer to what I'm aware of at the moment. One of the issues I've got when I start working in schools is really about what is it that schools think they're getting when they're going to become a restorative school. And do they want that to be in a 2-hour session, a 1-day session, or is it something they see as being important enough to take 2 years over? And so there are lots of reasons why schools approach people like myself to look at developing restorative practice. And I think we've got to ask them the question of what is it that you think it's going to do different to what you already do now? And I think that question is important, because if a school can't tell you what purpose restorative practice is going to have within and alongside and in synthesis with all the other practices in the school, it's very difficult to see how restorative practice will be anything other than a bolt-on. So for me, it's really important that we work with and challenge schools and other organisations, universities and further education sites to think carefully about what it is they're buying into. Because if they do embrace this and they do take it on, it is the proverbial can of worms, which once you open it, it can lead to some quite challenging conversations within schools. The other thing I think we've got a problem with is just the issue of definition about restorative practice. If we start with a restorative justice model, as we'll look at in a second, that will change the way restorative work's done in a school. If we start with a practice model, it will lead in a particular way. I particularly like and always thought was important for me the idea of transformative practice, really, because it seems to sit closer to where I was as the head teacher in a school that wanted to change culture and not just systems. It was about creating a new context in which we worked as both young people, as adults and as parents who were joining our community, but also having the skills within that culture to hold dialogue and conversations which were challenging and supportive, and that embraced a sort of an inclusive agenda in a way which we were not doing when we started. So I think this idea of a starting point, and if we look at the definition within the Scottish government, if what I believe is if we start with that as an idea of what restorative justice is within the school context, that will lead us on a destination which is very behaviourist, will be about policies and procedures. It will all be about the conference. It will all be around the harm that's been caused. It won't be around creating a context in which that harm happens less and less, and where young people themselves can be the finders of solutions to their own problems. So in terms of a definition, and it touches on something Belinda mentioned in the question, where are the adults in many conversations about restorative practice? Well, the adults are just as important as the young people. It's not about doing things to young people in a new way. It's about actually everybody who works within that community taking responsibility for behaviours that are significant and the minuscule behaviours as well, and languages. So everybody within a restorative environment should be sharing language and behaviours which are consistent and become default positions in the way that they present themselves and deal with other people. So it's about that context, and it's about the skills that we give them. And though as a school, 2007, we started out very much with the Wachtel quote that Dorothy mentioned. We very quickly, through practice and through conversations with young people and the teaching staff, realised that it was a done-to way of working. We wanted to change that to actually really engaging with young people in a way that wasn't lip service to their role within the school, but it was to create context in which they could really have a significant role within the school. And I also think, in terms of my thinking of restorative practice, is this umbrella term in which sits lots of other practices, lots of other ways of working. From at the one end and the right, the restorative meeting, the restorative conference, having people within the building and the school who can do those when necessary, and also young people who can do those when necessary. But actually realising we have to go all the way back along that continuum and think about just the way people talk to each other on a one-to-one basis, impromptu meetings or circle processes, mediation, counselling, all of those other processes that happen in schools, not at the exclusion of restorative practice or restorative practice at the exclusion of them, but actually of the menu of ways of working that a school needs to embrace to meet its particular needs, because each school's restorative practice will look different from another school's restorative practice. And the other issue we've got to deal with, of course, is the whole idea about restorative practice being a whole bunch of us sitting in circles, singing Kumbaya, passing out flowers and saying sorry. And I think that we've got to take responsibility for making sure when we're working with schools and we're working with communities who live around school, that we're very clear about the challenge and the support within restorative practice. And we have to address the elephants in the room and not shy away from those conversations, because they're very much at the heart of people's reactions just to the words restorative practice before we even start. The other issue for me, and it's become more and more increasingly problematic, to the extent now I don't really look to work where people come to me because you only work in schools where there are behaviour issues, you only work in schools that are in crisis, you only work in, get the restorative people in, open the magic box and there's the solution. So there's a real risk that restorative practice can be ghettoised in the sense of seen to be used for certain types of young people in certain situations. For me, it was very important in the Liverpool project, as we'll talk to in a second, that the range of schools we work in represent the two of the top schools in Liverpool, and now a pecking order, you put that together, as well as the special schools, as well as schools, primary schools in various geographic locations, as well as schools with huge ranges of diversity within them, and not to only be seen to be working with schools that had high incidences of fixed term exclusions, etc., etc. But there is that risk about restorative practice being seen as almost a last resort. And when it fails in those environments, because the failure is not necessarily about restorative practice, but because of circumstances within the school system itself and the local area, schools quickly revert back to a zero tolerance approach to things. And that elastic snapping of going from this attempt to be relational all the way to a zero tolerance is quite easy to follow that trail. Just in terms of referring back to our friend, the behaviour czar at the DFE, 1 in 10 teachers say restorative justice is undermining their ability to keep unruly pupils in check. He also talks about, in terms of perpetrators in regard to young people in schools. And he talks about the risks of full RJ. Now, there's 70, 80 people in this group we've got here. If anybody can tell me what full RJ is, I'd be really pleased, because it confuses me. But it is, again, an area we've got to contest and not allow agendas to be set by that mindset, because we have a situation in this country where at least 50% of the children are taught in trusts or in academies, and not all academies and trusts are the same. But if we were to do a survey, I would imagine disproportionately large percentage of those schools follow some sort of a zero tolerance or sanctions and reward behaviour response process. And for us to penetrate and to work within those environments is very, very challenging. It's not done easily. And certainly we're not going to get that from any national directives. So what happens in England, certainly, I think, is fantastic work happening across the country in individual schools or groups of schools. And there isn't really a coherent sense of an English model at the moment. And by that, I don't mean that we have one definitive way of working, but a sense of sharing data, sharing ideas. The process for that doesn't really exist at the moment. I think significantly as well, when people start on a restorative process, we have to think carefully about the means and ends by which we are going to go forward. Many people want something. We want to be a restorative school, and the means to getting there is completely unrestorative in any way, shape, or form. So we have to be very careful about the way we proceed. And this quote really is at the heart of everything I believe in terms of working with schools, working with young people, working with local authorities, is that we have to be really careful about, at the heart of all this is a common humanity. At the heart of all this is the realization that within diversity, the commonality is what will bring us together, and that we have to have a sense of this being about relationships, because if it's not, it becomes just another thing that somebody's going to pull out of a box. It's going to fail them, and then they'll move on from there. The other issue for me, before we start to look at the particular model I'm going to present, is just the idea of what it feels like to be on the receiving end of a restorative school experience. You know, schools who don't think about the messaging they're going to give to parents, to the young people themselves, to staff, tend to have immediately a barrier. But often I think what happens is that it looks more like this sort of image, that there's just mass confusion about what it is people are intending to do, how they're intending to do it, where they're intending to do it, and in what way, etc., etc. So we have to think really carefully about, not just at a national level in terms of communicating restorative practices, the strengths of it, but actually, if you're working within a school, what is it that you're doing to make sure that everybody engaged in the life of that school understands what it is we're doing? And I think that can be missed out. The eagerness to start the new process, the eagerness to embed it, the eagerness to train lots of staff so they can go chasing children around the building with some restorative questions, has got to be balanced against the messaging that we have. And a large amount of the work that I do, certainly with schools, is around how we're going to get this message out to as many people as possible in as many different ways as we have to. So some of the schools in Liverpool, everything we do is being translated into Arabic, and in one school into Portuguese because of the populations in those schools. And the young people do that for us, and we spend a long time trying to make sure the translation sits within not just the definition, but within any other processes that we need for them to be considering. So communication tends to break down, and when it breaks down, we end up with restorative practice as a tool, restorative practice as a misunderstood process. And then sitting within all of this is the young person themselves, in this particular case, surrounded by family, professional, school, and community in the wider sense. And the issue for schools doing restorative practice in isolation, for me, is that they can end up isolated. So where possible, we work always with, once we've started working in the school, we invite police, fire service. We invite any family workers into the training. We always deliberately put sessions on for parents, because without that, we're missing a trick. And actually, this joined up thinking around trying to make as many of those different groups understand the shared language and behaviours we're looking at is really significant. And none of them are any more important than the others. And I think that the idea of us just training adults in a school to go and sort of impart this information to young people is not the way that this thing works. And equally, starting just with the young people without bringing the adults on doesn't work. So we've got to look at how we bring all of these groups on at the same time. And when we're working with them, we've really got to also be quite strategic, because in working with a young person, there will be lots and lots of agencies in some cases working with them already. It could be family, it could be social services, it could be youth engagement, etc., etc. It could be the police. So we have to think about the school as a sort of a Venn diagram, and look at all of the agencies that impact on the school at any one time, and then start to think about, well, we can't all work with all these multiple agencies, and it could be 5 or 6 different agencies in the school in the middle. That's not going to happen. That just won't happen, because for lots of reasons: resources, readiness to make change, willingness to engage. Well, that shouldn't be the barrier towards. That shouldn't be the the barrier to the goal we're working towards, where we do want all of those agencies working in that centre there, where those circles intersect. But we can't expect that to be the case. So we've got to carefully plan for when different agencies can, at the speed they're capable of doing, and in a way which is efficient for them as well as for the young people, bring them into engaging with us, and look for finding small projects, not the big one with a young person in the middle, and slowly but surely sort of take these circles which may appear at 4 or 5 different points on a page, slowly apply some sort of a gravity to them which brings them closer together, and eventually we get the overlaps, and with the overlaps we get this sort of central idea of all of the work that we do with young people should be engaging with all of the agencies that potentially are out there to work with them. And if we've got that common thread of language and behaviour across agencies, that's really, really powerful. And the reason I'm using the Liverpool example today is because that's the closest at the moment for me in terms of a 5-year project where this is taking all of those steps as we've gone slowly along to get an engagement with multiple agencies. And this week we've just managed to get some agreement of working with fire service as well as the police around looking at responding to young people as an outcome of the COVID, the 6 months COVID, for some of the very complex areas of Merseyside. But that's happened over 5 years with a deliberate plan 5 years ago that these are all the agencies out there. Which ones can we engage with first? Not make excuses for agencies, but what does the map look like as we move towards the next 2 or 3 years in bringing people in? And some of that's done because if you have success breeds interest breeds people wanting to buy into it. But it's also done because deliberately we're not looking to drag people into the school, because the school can't survive under that much pressure at the start. All those life rafts arriving simultaneously just cause them to sink. But we will very carefully plan the process to bring those groups together. In terms of the last thing, really, before we look at the Liverpool context, is there is an issue, I think, in England around restorative is happening where there are restorative practitioners. That's not a good strategic model. There is no real sense of a best way forward. There are lots of research gaps. The issue of academies and trusts and local authority resourcing is a big problem for all of us, I think, working across England. And the very slow understanding of the police and crime commissioners and criminal justice entities around the connection between young people, young people's exclusions, county lines, gang culture, etc., and that maybe some of the money they have, if it was invested in schools, not around putting police officers in schools, but around that joined up thinking around where do we best intervene in a school and with which group at the right time would make a difference. We also suffer from, in England, a DFE, Ofsted and Ministry of Justice positions around restorative, which are not thought through and not really informed, and are a bit of a barrier. If a school's looking to find an excuse not to do restorative practice, there's plenty of evidence within those organisations to stop them. So the Liverpool project itself, at the moment, we're in the sort of second phase. It started with this desire by Liverpool to have a very, sort of, in a sense, reactive model. We've got lots of exclusions. What are we going to do about that? And it's moved towards a much more rounded model now, where we actually involve schools that are not just those who have got high exclusion rates. With those two very high achieving ex-independent schools working with children on the autistic spectrum, schools working with children in behaviour problems, schools in very difficult areas of housing, and schools that are in the middle. And there are 15 schools at the moment following on a 6-school pilot. They all involve the training of a senior leadership team, because if they don't get it, it tends to fail. We build guiding teams in the schools so that the schools are not reliant on the trainer model of somebody coming in and you always need to wait for the trainer to arrive. So the guiding teams are made up of staff from within the school. There's regular supervision of each individual school and across all of the schools. The support network is built all the time. There's a restorative thinking curriculum, so we're not just looking at restorative practice around conflict. We actually build a large element of this is around learning behaviours and and relational and practice, circles work, and etc. etc. The collection of data is very strong in Liverpool, and has been until COVID. We would have had the second report out, and we work very closely with parents where we can. The model is that everybody in the school should have a universal understanding of using circles, language, etc., etc. That where possible, as people are ready, they develop the skills to manage different types of conflict, and the very small number of people at the very top of that pyramid are actually dealing with the more complex issues around behaviour, maybe bullying, etc., etc. So there was some very approaches that we use where there's very clear criteria for school selection. We interview schools to have a sense of why is it you want to do this. Very early and sustained engagement and real explanation to schools about, if you do this, this is what it'll look like. This is what it might feel like. Are you ready for that? Having very honest conversations about those things. We build guiding teams into the schools with the idea that Liverpool will and has now got 24 teachers who are 2 or 3 years into this process now, who are now delivering training for other schools. And we front load the training with a one-day awareness, and from that point onwards, it builds around whatever the individual needs of a school are, is the direction we follow. Regular supervision, as I said, guiding team doing their own training, but very clear and explicit statements from the start that this is as much about teaching and learning as it is about behaviour. And in fact, really, it's about teaching and learning, and behaviour will follow. We are very outcomes focused, but we also work within individual schools around some of the things that if we can get early wins on, that will make a difference in winning hearts and minds, because I'm under no illusion that people have spent their entire lives waiting for me to walk into a building so that everybody becomes restorative. And then there's very clear reporting by the school to the family strategic group. So the accountability at every level, from the council level all the way down to the individual school, is very precise. We take very seriously the contention that very few of the decisions we make aren't free from dangerous possibilities. So some of our evaluation is not only about what we've produced, but how have we gone about doing that? Is that something we want to do again? Because though it may have had a positive outcome, it's actually not really been a very restorative way of doing things. So data, again, all these slides will be available. So things like 51% reduction in exclusions, obviously that increases attendance, etc. One of the key factors across all of the schools, and this is just one school's example, is the well-being of staff within the building. And though we don't go out as this is a primary thing we're going to measure, but that's not unusual data to find staff sickness absence, staff feelings of well-being to be dramatically increased. And
I'm Logan.
I'll just introduce you to these two gentlemen. They can tell you a little bit about them before we come to the end.
5 minutes. Huh?
Yep.
I'm Logan.
From Liam.
I was on the verge of exclusion, and Miss came up to me one lesson. I think it was in Matt, and then she said, "Do you want to start some restorative practice thing?" And I was like, "Yeah, tell me about it." And it's basically ways to stop getting yourself angry or getting yourself into trouble. But if you're not into trouble, just how to deal with it.
Yeah, I used to go through exclusions quite regularly. Used to constantly be in trouble when going into school meetings.
Actually, when I started paying attention and listening, it started affecting me in a good way. So
started realising the change, noticing my grades starting to improve.
So we've met regularly. We've had 1 week, a session a week, where I've delivered the restorative thinking toolkit, which teaches them about empathy, encourages them to discuss the ripple effect of their actions. It teaches them the social discipline window, how to manage anger. That anger is just really masking the problem, and they've just taken it on board.
And so on the Restorative Thinking website, all those films are free. We think it's very important to film young people. Early years group there's the example here of a problem-solving process done in a circle by a year 4 pupil, so about 6 years old, where he, after talking about his feelings in an early morning circle, The teacher then arranges for some staff, for some other pupils to sit with him and look at solutions to some of the problems he had around his anger. So making sure restorative practice isn't just a reaction to behaviour, but actually giving children the skills to support each other, to have conversations in which they can feel vulnerable, but at the same time know that the support's coming from colleagues. In terms of takeaways, I think it's quite important that we don't use restorative justice only as a model of conferencing. We allow restorative justice to be part. If we do that, it'll become part of disproportionately working with certain groups. If we only wait for the young people who are already getting in trouble in other parts of school systems to be engaged in restorative practice, we tend to be they're the only ones that ever do any restorative processes. All of us in the restorative community need to ensure the principles and practices of restorative justice are understood by a wider audience, especially those in positions to advise and make policy. Restorative practice is developing in many schools in England and Wales, but there's no network that captures it. This puts us on the back foot with a very dominant paradigm built around sanctions of behavioural thinking leading schools that thought. RP needs to ensure its successes and practices are visible, understood, and needs to stop having as its starting point an apology for what it's not, or defining itself in criminal justice terms. RP emphasises social learning over social compliance, responsibility over conformity, and engagement with the world instead of passivity. Because restorative practice allows an engagement with self and others, it allows schools and communities to develop cultures for learning that are a product of both the children, the young people, and the staff. Our restorative practice advocates also need to find ways to be heard, to show value in what we've achieved, to stop advocating worthiness in spaces where people are already in agreement with us, but get into spaces where we challenge the dominant paradigm by walking towards it and not backing away. Because if not, we end up with exactly the same as before, and we just pretend it's not. Okay.
Thank you very much, Chris. So that was great. So I think we'll just go to our final paper for today by Gillian McCluskey, Professor Gillian McCluskey, from who is professor in the School of Education and Sports at Edinburgh University. She focuses her research and teaching on restorative practices in education and also exclusions. So, Gillian, the floor is yours, 30 minutes.
Hi, folks. Sorry, when I loaded my slides up earlier, they've worked perfectly, but now, of course, they're misbehaving. So if you don't mind just giving me a minute, I think I know how to sort it out.
That's you.
Excellent. Good. That's good news. So good afternoon, and thanks, Estelle, for the introduction. It's hard to come at the end of what's been a really good day that's made me think about a lot of things, some new, some old, and some in really different ways. But what I've been asked to do and tasked with doing is taking this to Scotland and seeing how we can think about where we are and where we're going. And a bit like Chris, I'm very aware that on our call this afternoon, there's people who are engaged in the day-to-day, in those daily interactions with youngsters, with parents, with colleagues in restorative ways that I do not have access to. So I'm at a slight distance, and I can only hope that what I say is at least contributes to the discussion and helps us to think about some of the things that we wrestle with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the
policies we have in Scotland, because again, this will be very familiar for some people and it will be completely new for others, but I think it's really important to know where we're coming from when we talk about restorative practices in Scotland in schools. And just to say that Chris's definition that he was referring to was for restorative justice, not for restorative practices in education and schools. So I want to start by looking at the policies, the main policies. And then I want to move on to COVID and restorative practices. And I really am wondering whether we can go back to what we thought was okay about restorative practices in education in Scotland, whether we can simply resume or whether we have to renew, and if so, in what ways, what are the ways that really matter if we're going to do things differently with restorative. And from there, I want to look at whether our guiding principles in working restoratively can help us in this very uncertain present and probably even more uncertain future. And from those principles, I then want to look at some of the practicalities that might arise for us in this Scottish context, but I'm hoping for more broadly as well, internationally, asking some of the same questions, what the practicalities we'd need to think about in these turbulent times. So, as I said, I'm just going to have a quick look at the policies, first of all. So what I'm showing you here is two absolutely standard policies that will be familiar to anybody working in schools in Scotland, whether that's primary, high school, special. And on the left is what we might in the old days have called the discipline policy. And on the right, on my screen anyway, is what we would have called the exclusions policy. But what I really, of course, want to point out is that the one on the left is called better relationships, better learning, better behaviour. The very first thing it talks about is relationships. And it joins that to learning. And it mentions behaviour, but behaviour comes last. So I think that aligns with a lot of the threads of the arguments we've been talking about so far today in the different inputs. And then the one on the right, again, I could say the same sorts of things. This is when things go wrong, when you have a youngster who's in a really difficult place, and school staff are finding it very difficult to keep them in school because of their behaviour. Our policy is called included, engaged and involved. So the emphasis is on inclusion. It's on keeping kids engaged, and it's on keeping them involved. And you'll notice it talks about preventing and then managing school exclusions. I think language is really important here. The part 2 is a bit annoying, quite frankly, but just in case that's going to bother you, part 1 is about attendance. So there's a whole separate document which comes at things of the same set of principles, about inclusion, about keeping kids involved. But that's the part 1 is about attendance, and part 2 is about avoiding exclusions where possible. And I see these as good things. And I've just got a very quick couple of quotes from these different documents. So this is the one on better relationships, better learning, better behaviour, which a lot of people call BBBL for short. And you'll see here that we do have fewer and fewer children being excluded. And this is put down to a focus on social and emotional well-being and an ethos or climate of mutual respect and trust. And if we look at I wanted to say to you that this policy comes out of a lot of the research that was done. It's not entirely, but it draws heavily on the research on restorative practices that was done in the mid-2000s in Scotland. And the documents itself, both the exclusion one and this behaviour one, the better relationships one, refer frequently to restorative work or restorative practices or restorative approaches. And I've given you one example there on the right. I realise that might be a bit small, but you'll get the size later and have a chance to look at it. But what I'm really doing here is just saying, look, this is how it translates. These policies come from research, they inform research, and they refer to things that can be done restoratively in schools. So this is national policy guidelines. And in the same way, looking at included, engaged and involved, we're looking at the policy guidelines for schools, repeating that message about focus on prevention, thinking about pupils or students as individuals, an emphasis on learning and teaching. Again, these same messages about prevention, really saying very clearly exclusion should only be used as a last resort. It should be, the views of the child and young person should be taken into account. And I think significantly that this last sentence I think is really important too. And the purpose of the exclusion should be taken into consideration, including the long-term impact on life chances. Because this document, although I don't have time to go into it here, lays out some of those negative impacts on life chances for young people that are put out of school, either temporarily or more long-term. So if I'm thinking about the principles that would underlie that, I think you can already see that that what we're seeing is something that's proactive, it's focused on prevention, it draws on research on restorative approaches, and to me it seems to have quite a restorative set of underpinnings. And I know that sometimes when I'm trying to avoid using the word restorative because of all the baggage it draws for some people, going back to some of the things Chris said about, we're a whole load of tree-hugging, knit your own sandal brigade, then I think that at quite a simple human level we can make this connection to what we see when somebody stumbles, when they get things wrong, when we make mistakes, whether that's a child or a colleague or a parent. Our natural instinct is to reach out and help. So at some level, alongside these principles, I think it's really important to hang on to that idea of a common humanity and a common understanding of the fact that we all need help some of the time. So we've got these policies, they look really good, and perhaps in contrast to some other country contexts close by to Scotland, they're very, very very strongly supported by government, and I see that as a fantastic thing. I think we're very, very fortunate. Informed by research, but I'm going to point out what I think to be some of the real problems about that now. As I do that, I want to now move from those general ideas about policy and context to look at where we are in terms of COVID. And that's why I asked in my introduction whether we can resume or renew when we think about restorative working. Already in the last 6 months, we have seen shifts of the like we have never seen in education before. They're almost daily in terms of policy, in terms of what can happen in a school. It's really hard to keep up. There has been some research already, and I'm involved in a small piece of research at the moment, which I might refer to, but it's not completed yet, looking at the effects of COVID on school students and their mental health and well-being. But one of the most useful bits of research that came out already was called Lockdown Lowdown, a really straightforward, great survey, really clear in the messages about the effects of lockdown on young people, of being in isolation, of schools being closed, of exams being cancelled, national exams being cancelled. And you won't be surprised to know that this Lockdown Lowdown survey reveals a lot about the very negative impacts for young people. Really, really difficult situations for young people. But I've put here that I want to pick up this issue about differential effects of lockdowns. And this, in part, goes back to some of the things particularly Dorothy was saying earlier on as well. This is not the same for all young people. It is not the same for all young people. I think it's really vital if we're thinking about how we can use restorative thinking or restorative practices going forward, we need to really think about this really carefully. And unfortunately, the research we've undertaken to date in Scotland is now completely out of date on this front. And it does need addressed. So I'm wondering whether we need to think about whether there are new vulnerabilities in this pandemic. whether there are new inequalities or adding or exacerbating the inequalities that we are already very aware of in our work. Transitions seems to me to be an obvious one. I can't go through all of these, but I'm hoping that as you look at them, there will be ones that speak to you. Transitions is one of the ones that we're looking at, particularly in the study on young people who should have been sitting national exams and the effects on mental health and well-being. Or what about the issues around losing a loved one, losing a family member over the last few months? I mean, there has been so much in the press about the effects of that and the real difficulties, both in practical and emotional terms, for young people and their families who've had to go through this. We've also talked, thank goodness, and recognise now the differential effects for Black, Asian and other minority groups, the effect of COVID. How does that work out for children and young people in our schools? And what are we actually doing to address it? Poverty is always there, and we also know it is one of the issues that plays through in COVID as well. And what does restorative practices do about that? In the same way that I think earlier on today, Dorothy used the phrase race-neutral implementation of restorative practices. I wonder if one of our problems, one of our challenges, is that we have a kind of almost context inequalities neutral version of restorative practices in that policy. It does speak to, our policy guidelines do speak about some of these issues, but they don't translate into a kind of different way of doing things in practicalities. And I think that's what's lacking. And I noticed some of the questions in the chat were very much about that. So thinking about what, where schools are at in the midst of all this, I think there's been a lot of really good discussion in the professional press, for teachers. So this is our Times Educational Supplement, which is, again, will be really familiar to teachers and people who work in and around schools. This is what teachers read in our country. And you can see here a couple of examples, 6 months of chaos. I thought this one on the right was how vital is touch to teaching. I think it's absolutely vital that we should be asking that question. One of the things that has been so difficult over the last wee while, and I think we're still struggling to articulate, is what we lose when we do meetings like this online. The face-to-face or the opportunity for closeness of human beings is so important to us, They make other things possible, and I think we need to think carefully about how that is affecting both staff and young people. And this was almost a reminder to me to say out loud that it's not just about students. This is definitely about the school community. It's about teachers, classroom assistants, kitchen staff, playground assistants. It's parents, it's everybody when we talk about restorative and about the impact at this moment in time. So if we were thinking about restorative practice as guiding principles in this very uncertain time and uncertain future, I was looking at this kind of very, very straightforward list from the international educationalist Pasi Sahlberg. Don't think students only learn when they're taught. Don't worry about losses on school tests. Don't expect students to be ready to continue where they left off. Don't consider break time as a low priority. And don't expect there to be a new normal anytime soon. Well, I think we've kind of recognised that one. I'm really not sure we've done very well on the others. The research study that I'm currently doing around mental health and well-being for youngsters I've been involved in 4 focus groups, leading 4 focus groups with young people. And although the findings haven't been analysed in full, what I would say is my preliminary kind of analysis of this is that students are expected to continue where they left off. And one really kind of difficult thing that a young person said in one of the focus groups last week to me was that they'd gone, remembering that schools have been back in in mid-August in Scotland, so a bit earlier than perhaps some other countries. So when they returned, after an initial question by perhaps their guidance or personal and social education teacher, for example, about how they were feeling, they really were expected to carry on. And they didn't have the opportunities to talk through how it had been for them and how they might start to process what had happened over the last few months. And indeed, when they went into the one lesson which should have been the place for that personal and social education lesson, they were told that they were going to be filling in their university application forms. So when that one young person in that group said that, 15 other people did the thumbs up sign to agree with that. So I'm not saying that happens in every school, but on that focus group, nearly everybody it had happened to. And I wonder why. Now, I'm not in a blame game for teachers here. That's not what I'm saying. I think we need to understand why it is that teachers perhaps stood back from that. That's for discussion. I won't go into it here, but something happened, and the opportunity for restorative conversations, which would allow people to assess where we're at, to integrate the difficult feelings, emotions and actions and events of the last few months. These opportunities are not being taken. And I genuinely think restorative practices offers a really concrete, practical set of tools and a way to deal with that. That's an opportunity missed. And what else? What else am I noticing? I'm noticing that while kids have been out of school, enormously important other things have been happening around gender, around Black Lives Matters, around Extinction Rebellion. These have been times of ferment in so many ways, and young people are part of that, and the adults that work with them are part of that. So I'm coming to a point, I suppose, in this input to ask how restorative practices can be different. I think we have really good examples from research and practice in North America in particular, where we see that the possibilities of working restoratively to address inequalities, we have good examples, we have good models. And we have a duty, I think, to do something different here. Otherwise, we will continue to make the same mistakes we're making. So we have this national policy which says restorative practice is a good thing and should be used as often as we can and in many different situations in and around schools. But we still have the same kids being excluded from school. So at the moment, we have a discontinuity, I think, between what restorative practices says and actually what is happening. Our exclusion rates seem to have come down very, very significantly. But I think of it sometimes as like a river, and when the water recedes, the rocks remain. So the difficulties, it's still boys, it's still poor kids, it's still more likely to be youngsters who've got family issues or have some kind of additional learning need. What are we doing about that, and what can restorative practices do to help us? What can we do in Scotland that could be different and build on the really good examples we've got from elsewhere? So, if we're thinking about the practicalities, this is where it might get tricky. I've only got a couple of suggestions, and I'm really keen to hear what other people have got to say, and I'm sure people will have good things to say. Yes, I still think we need to focus our energies on building a restorative climate and ethos, the skills of youngsters, the skills of adults with them, so that when conflict does arise, we're better able to address it. I think everything that's been said about the importance of monitoring and evaluating and gathering data of different kinds and understanding the stories behind data, all of that still applies. It's absolutely vital. And I think that our government in Scotland is committed to helping children, young people in schools. So I start from that, which is a good position to be in, but I have some worries. And I'm just going to share with you an example of one of those worries. So what I've put here is, this is an advert, a job advert from the Times Educational Supplement. And very recently, you can see the closing date there is the 25th of September, a couple of days ago. These are posts funded to help with COVID. Teacher, primary, COVID-19, restart and recovery. Now, I might say that's fantastic. There's a recognition that we need additional support, that everybody's going to have to do things differently. We're going to have to put new resources in. But I worry about this. Because what I worry is we're going to have this situation where some people are seen to be riding to the rescue of schools and having the job to do to work restoratively or to sort the problem that COVID has created. And I'm not sure that's the way we should be spending our time and resources. There is much more evidence that a universal approach works than a targeted approach overall. So this worries me. I feel more positive about some other strands of support that look as though they're emerging. This was one example of work that's been done fairly recently about something that I've been concerned about for a long time, which is the lack of structured supervision and support for teachers who work with young people directly in their place of difficulty, whether that's around behaviour or emotions or a crisis or anything. So in Scotland, we often call them guidance teachers or pastoral care teachers. And as a result of a number of different moves by different parts of the thing that is education, what we have is a new initiative which was just announced a couple of weeks ago, which seeks to support teachers, new teachers, around mental health and around professional learning opportunities and so on, coaching and mentoring. Now, I don't know exactly how that's going to work out. And there may be other things that I'm not so aware of. So forgive me if this is a bit of a partial picture. I'm really aware that local authorities will be doing lots and lots of good things. Part of my concern is that until we have good research and ways of gathering that, we're not sharing the messages as broadly as we should be, and we're not understanding what works, and then kind of thinking about how to take those questions, like my question about what we're going to do to make restorative more equalities informed, so we don't keep making the same mistakes. I do think we need new research after all that's happened over the last few months in terms of Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement. So I do see signs of hope. I do have concerns. And I realise I'm actually going to finish slightly ahead of time, but I'm going to finish with my next slide. They always say, a crisis is an opportunity. I'm not sure I like that phrase, but the crisis is a bit of a crossroads, I think, for how we do restorative in schools, not just in Scotland. Things are never going to go back to what they were. And I think we have to understand that and do something about it. So it's about what we can learn and what we can do differently. We can't build walls to keep out all the conflict, all the problems, the inequalities and harm. We can't keep out the tensions that are around in society, nationally and internationally, the very legitimate concerns that disenfranchised groups have been able to express more clearly over this summer. So I'm going to suggest that it is time to press reset on restorative work in schools. And I think we need to find a way for it to challenge and address what I've called new vulnerabilities or exacerbated inequalities. I think it can do that. I think it's up to us to find a way. So I look forward to the questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Gillian. Steve? Yeah. I'll hand the floor to you.
Yes, thanks very much. Thanks so much for both of those excellent presentations. I've got a few questions from our audience. So I'll go to you first, Chris. We've got a question from Pauline Lynch. She said, some experts on autism feel restorative conversations need skills that autistic learners don't have. Therefore, it is not just to take this approach. What's your experience? And I've also noted that actually in the chat here, several other audience members have mentioned that there are some approaches that are being used, sometimes for quite a long period, actually, in relation to students and pupils with autism.
I think that the question could be sort of broadened, that most children, most adults find this difficult, maybe don't have the skills or the emotional language to really engage at the beginning with restorative processes in the way that we would like them to. And that's our responsibility as educators and as trainers to actually work with them to develop a ladder of emotional language and find the ways in which they work. And some children find it very difficult to make eye contact. What does a circle look like for children in that situation? How do you run a circle with children with very limited, if any, verbal language? Yet that's happening certainly in the two schools in Liverpool. And I know that Terence and Belinda have worked in schools, other schools in England where that's working. The key is really summed up, I suppose, in my first response to going on a restorative path, which was my reason for not doing it was me saying, I don't think my kids will sit in a circle and talk about the feelings. And what I meant was, I'm not ready to sit in a circle with kids and talk about their feelings. And it requires a sort of not a courageous thing, but a willingness to have that understanding that it's going to be tough. This doesn't happen naturally because the education system in general doesn't prepare young people to have emotional vocabulary. That may be quite damning thing to say. And so teachers get frustrated at the beginning with the responses they get. But it's about persistence. It's about developing that ladder of language. So I think any group that you look at, you could say there's a barrier to them engaging with it. The answer to sorting through that barrier is for them and you to come up and co-create the way you're going to move forward and not think for them how it can be done. And so engaging with those groups is significantly important.
Thanks very much. Another question for you, Chris, from Wilma Barrow. How do you avoid RJ being perceived by young people as another intervention for individuals perceived as challenging?
Well, because if you only, I think Dorothy mentioned this, and I think I mentioned this, if your starting point is you only use restorative practice to deal with conflict, you only ever come across those kids, and the only people seeing it and using the language are those particular groups of kids. So you've got to broaden it as a whole cultural thing within a school. So the use of circles for non-crisis processes, the use of circles for building relationships, the use of the language in proactive and productive and ways of finding something good that's happened and having that conversation. So the danger is that when schools only pursue that sort of reactive way of using restorative practice, that's not the whole school population invariably never comes across it, or if they do, they know they're in trouble. So it's a matter of using it in almost every interaction, or the principles behind it in every interaction in the school. So it becomes part of learning. It's the way we do things here.
Thanks very much. I've got another question for you, Chris. So this is from Luke Roberts. He asks, what is the difference between multi-agency partnerships, for example, Team Around the Child or public health approach to youth violence, and restorative practice? Is this label being appropriated to describe a response to the old problem of silo working?
So is that restorative practice being used instead of Team Around the Child, etc.?
I think, actually, Luke, if you're there, do you want to just come in just to clarify your question for Chris?
Sure. Hi, Chris. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a danger in saying that we're working in a restorative way when actually we're just working in a multi-agency way.
Yep.
And we're using language or agreed labels to do what organisations have been trying to do for years.
Yep.
And so they're therefore appropriating the language of restorative to give them that commonality.
Yeah, I think that the risk is always that all of the, restorative either appropriates or is appropriated in different by different organisations. I think for me the reality is that we've got systems like Team Around the Child, Team Around the Family, all of those meeting processes, and the key thing is that we can't just wish them away if we don't think that they're working effectively. What we've got to do is I suppose, is use the principles and values within restorative practice as a check against the way they behave and the language they use within those meetings. All we can try and do is influence the way that they work in terms of giving more voice to the family or the child. I think that one of the problems with professionals in any capacity is the stealing of stories from communities and from individuals. And the one thing I think restorative practice is strong at, both in terms of the context it creates and the skills it gives people, is giving the story back to the child or the mum or the dad, because professional meetings as they sit at the moment, I know there are some very good ones, but there are some just too horrendous to even think about. 20 professionals in a room all hiding behind laptops and mum or dad at the end then being asked what they think about what people have said. And I think when restorative practice is not appropriated, but actually it sort of infiltrates and influences the practice of those people in those meetings still call the same thing, but the behaviours within them different. And it's a very, very obviously slow process. But if that's happening in those meetings, it's also happening in the way schools are engaging with young people, in the way that family teams are working in the home. That's when I think you can try and get sort of an explicit and deliberate practice. But it's a challenge, and there's always the risk of appropriation and being appropriated by any of the institutions in which we all engage with.
Thanks very much. Okay, Gillian, we've got a couple of questions for you here. We've got another question from Luke Roberts, our most active question asker. So, Gillian, what makes these vulnerabilities you refer to new? These seem to be systemic inequalities which were there prior to COVID. Did restorative practices address these before?
I think that's a really fair point. I think probably I'm not putting it as clearly as I want to yet, but when I talk about new vulnerabilities, I think I'm trying to draw attention to new experiences of vulnerability or new ways in which inequalities have affected people. If to go back to the example around bereavement, we've just never seen a situation where, certainly in our country context, or in high-income countries, where someone could not be with their loved ones, or could not touch them, or could not be at their parting from this life. And we've seen that over the last few months. So perhaps it's about understanding that may have impacts we cannot begin to yet interrogate. So I'm saying new vulnerabilities because I think it might just be that we need to recognise this unique set of circumstances as new, and often it's about adding, it is unfortunately about adding to something that is already, as you say, systemic and structural inequalities. But I just think we need to really untangle it. I think we need to not make assumptions. We need to just pause and to listen to it first, to understand it. And sorry, there was a second part to that question, wasn't there? And I've lost it.
It was, did restorative practices address these before?
I think at the individual level, my sense is that there's a lot of really, really good practice and that people do that as best they can. But I think it needs to be supported at a policy level so that people have more than permission. They have to do it. They have kind of support to do it. And that's what I think we are probably lacking in our context. And I think that's not helped by the fact that the research we draw on is so out of date. And when we undertook the research, it was pretty decontextualised. There was nothing about inequalities in that research, although it was good in other ways.
Thanks very much. And just a reminder that if you've got questions, please put them in the chat. We've got until 4:30 scheduled for the discussion here. So another question for you, Gillian, from Belinda Hopkins. She says, thank you for your inspiring talk. You've suggested that prevention should be the major piece of a restorative approach, followed by intervention, crisis intervention, and evaluation. I am wondering where there is then space for proactively not just preventing, but actually building the system we want. In other words, frame our work not about moving away from something, but moving towards something, not focusing on what we don't want, but what we do want, to draw on an idea from NLP. This may mean some reframing of our message.
I'm totally with you. What can I say? That just seems to me to be really, of course, what we want. I totally agree. I think it's really difficult because when we're talking particularly about education today, schools are really difficult places because they have this, you have a right to go to school, but you also have a duty, don't you? You know? So it's an odd institution to talk about moving away and moving to, because the context in which we're doing it is actually a really unusual system, you know? So when we talk about voluntariness or, inviting people into a conversation, a restorative conversation, it has a completely different context and starting point, doesn't it, in a school than it might have in a community setting. Yeah, so I think we've got challenges that are structural when we talk about moving away from and moving to. But in terms of, do I want to be doing that? That's exactly what I want to do, despite the difficulties. So yeah, good question. I'm totally with you.
Hey, thanks very much. I'm going to go back to some of the questions that people asked earlier of the previous speakers. So can I first check, Dorothy, you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful. I have a question here for you from Wilma Barrow. She asks, what hope or opportunity is there for developing a culture of relationality in schools when a performative emphasis continues within the wider education system?
Okay, you know what? I'm actually looking for it in print on the chat because I'm finding it really difficult.
Just paste it again in the chat just so that you can easily see it.
Okay, I actually found it. Okay. So what hope or opportunity is there for developing a culture of relationality in schools when a performative emphasis continues? I actually, as much as I often ask the very challenging and the difficult questions, I actually have a lot of hope for restorative justice in education, as long as we can ask those difficult questions. So in terms of developing a culture of relationality when there's a performative emphasis, I think it's the little steps. It's the little steps forward. It's the little steps towards discomfort rather than accepting that this is the way it is. So when we recognize, when we can see that in spite of all the nice words in our policies that point to more relationality, which is very hopeful, but then we see that that there's this ongoing demand for empirical evidence, right? Then I think we need to, it's about scaffolding. It's about taking small steps forward. So when there's a performative emphasis, we need educators not to be followers, right? And I think about Henry Giroux's term, teachers as transformative intellectuals. I don't know whether your situation in Scotland is what I find here often, is that teachers don't see themselves as transformative intellectuals. Even administrators don't see themselves as transformative intellectuals. They see themselves as having been hired by the government to do what the government says, right? So what hope is there? I think we need, and this is what restorative justice has done for me, restorative justice education. What it's done for me, it's given me a confidence in understanding who we are as human beings. And in that confidence of understanding who we are as human beings, then when I see how humanity is being undermined, I take steps forward into that discomfort. So it's not going to change overnight. And all of us have said this. And I'm very envious of Finland and Scotland and England, where it is written into your documents already. And there's lots of good things happening in Canada and in Newfoundland and Labrador, but we need to, I think we need to understand that the hope is in taking the small steps forward. The hope is in making explicit the reality that some are still very much benefiting with the implementation of restorative justice education, and others are still bearing a burden. So, you know, it's a complicated question. Is there a hope and is there opportunity? Yes, as long as we support each other in being transformative intellectuals, regardless of our role in the school. And that would go for custodians and as well.
Thanks very much. We've got a question here from Terence Bevington. It seems to be an open question, which is, what is the work that's still to be done to make explicit the connections between restorative practice and social justice? I wondered which of our contributors wants to have a shot at that.
Could I link that to Deborah's at the end of Deborah's question, which is around very sort of similar thing. I think it's finding a mechanism in England anyway, where groups of like-minded people have got a forum through which they can communicate the successes and the value of restorative practice in a school setting. I think that we've got to snatch the agenda back from the very dominant paradigm in this country, which is led by the DFB, and having tried to move the monolith that is for a short period of time, that can't be done by a sort of one individual. And I think that we leave ourselves open to this idea that it's all about behaviour, it's not about transformation in a sense, Terence's question, and about social justice, etc. And dealing with inequalities. It's about all of those things. But I think that we articulate it well within the areas we're working in a direct relational way, but we've not captured the national imagination on that. And that's something I think is significant, because we don't have the government backing in the way that Scotland is edging towards and has already got to some degree. So and equally, somebody's mentioned, how long do we have to wait? Well, it's going to take a while. And but that's not a reason for us to sort of pursue it. But I think we have to look at schools not in isolation, but in relationship to all of those other agencies that work with them, and look within each geographical area what's the best combination of those different groups that we can bring together to have an impact on the lives of young people and families. And it will look different in different areas, but I think we've got to be more strategic about the way we do that. And I think that's a very big challenge.
Very much. Gillian, did you want to come in there on that question about the connections between restorative practice and social justice?
It seems to me on the questions we've had this afternoon that these connections have been implicit in a lot of what people have said or asked about. And I actually do wonder whether Belinda's question about working more explicitly across these two fields would be helpful. I think probably many of us do it individually in our own ways. I know there are people on the call who've got a really, really strong commitment to this. But it probably isn't the way to get government involved. Now, there's lots of people, certainly in Scottish Government, who do have a commitment to social justice. But they like the data too, don't they? They need that kind of functionalist side of it, that instrumental side. So I don't think we can limit ourselves to saying this is about social justice, even though it might be a driver for me or you. I think we have to keep appealing to wherever it will work And that might sound a bit too pragmatic and a bit mercenary, but my interest is in getting it to work. Yeah.
Gillian, we've got another question there from Sam Thornley.
Yeah.
Given that transforming cultures is a long process, perhaps we have to lower our expectations on how quickly this can be done. Are there examples in Scotland where restorative approaches are continuing to embed 5 or even 10 years after they were first implemented?
Sure, and there's people on this call who are much better qualified to talk about that in detail. I know there's a lot of, there's been a number of people, I'm not sure if they're still here because I know this has been a long afternoon, but people in local authorities who have taken this work ahead over a long period of time and very, very effectively. Yeah, the quick answer is yes. And some of them are here.
I'll read out this other question from Deborah Mitchell. I very much appreciate Gillian's slide title, Restorative Practice as a Principled Disruptor. It seems to me this fits with its transformative potential, but schools will not invite in disruptors, however principled. Scotland has achieved the policy change that must precede this role. What is your advice, Gillian, about how to achieve this policy change in England? And could Chris also comment on how we can collaborate to achieve this? So, Gillian, do you want to go first there?
Yeah, it's maybe a quick thing because I think Chris is probably better placed. But the reason it gained ground in Scotland was because of a really big rise in exclusion rates. I think at the moment we could be talking. The reason I've kind of really wanted to talk about COVID today is that I think we should be making a link between what restorative practices can offer at this time of crisis. And that might be one of the ways that we need to take it ahead and give it a new energy in Scotland. But I want to hand over to Chris because I think it's really important.
I think an example of maybe where we're making progress, because where one local authority does something, others sort of watch, is Merseyside Police coming almost out of the blue, really, halfway through, about 2 months ago, and actually looking for a way forward with what they anticipate will be antisocial behaviour and kids' behaviours as expressions of their needs that they've got around trauma, etc. To look for a different way of dealing with them and supporting schools in being restorative, in whatever definition that is. That's very transformative in a sense, and most schools who take on restorative practice may not use the word transformation, but actually it's inherent to them because the way they work with families and the way they work with a whole range of different agencies. So I think there is, where you're able to show the evidence of success in those very pragmatic ways Gillian just mentioned, it's important that you address introductions and exclusions. It's important you address improvements in X, Y, and Z. We shouldn't shy away from that, but at the same time, schools are much more than just factories for pushing kids out into a workplace, I hope. And it clearly is in certain areas that they're looking at what's gone well and what can we do in a very almost a short-term process at the beginning, and then embed that in other ways later on. So I think we shouldn't. It's difficult to see the journey being a fast one, but there are pockets now where people are approaching restorative trainers and consultants and different agencies and asking for advice, and I think we shouldn't underestimate that.
Thanks very much. We've got also, this might be an opportunity to bring Maya back in. I see that Belinda Hopkins has asked whether Maya wants to comment on policy change at a national level in Finland. Maya, do you want to come in on that?
No, well, actually it has not been a very easy way. So as I said, that we have been doing 20 years work here, and maybe the most important thing was in the very beginning of when we started around 2000, this work with the peer mediators in schools, that the feedback of the work they did in school and the success they have in those schools with peer mediators, the feedback went into the Ministry of Education, and we got more funding for develop more this project at that time. And ever since, I think there has always been kind of a strong person from the school staff members and from the schools that have been taking care of talking about the restorative approaches and mediation in schools in every now and then. And at the same time, of course, we have been doing a lot of work, like Belinda said, that it has been a kind of way to do so. It's everywhere we could have been able to rise up our results of the work we have been doing, and so it's the long way. And like many says that we need some special persons in schools and in decision makers that somehow understand the value of restorative approach, and then we can go with those and get some possibilities to come and tell more about the results and the ideas and values and so on and so on. So I still have the situation here in Finland that if I think, for example, that I was working in this expert group of Ministry of Education, I felt that half of the experts were thinking that we need to have sanction-based methods in our schools, and half of them were thinking that we need to respect child-friendly approaches, and they were very interested in restorative approach. And this happens 5 years ago, so it's still there that we are working on the changing the attitudes, and so there is no one way. It's just to do the work, and just like I said, we need to have this data collection and statistics to share, and we need to have also good experiences and good practices to share to make this visible, this work that has been done in schools. So maybe this is my answer.
Thanks very much. We've got just about 5 minutes left. We've got a question here from Edward McGee, which I'll just read out, and then we can see who wants to reply. What are the key psychological elements which underpin successful RJ that are required in young people that participate in RJ and those that conduct RJ? Can these elements be identified, measured, and promoted? Who wants to take a shot at that one?
Well, I'll throw a starter in for 10. It goes back to, in a sense, Luke's point about RJ, being very careful that RP and RJ doesn't appropriate other people's language and things. Mm-hmm. I think that the conversation, a good RP conversation or process is the same as any process two human beings engage in, where there's trust, valuing the other opinion, empathy, etc., etc. So I think it's, if we're training people to be good RP facilitators, we actually make all of those things explicit. But I think that a good conversation between two people is in itself restorative. It doesn't need to necessarily be called that. But when you start working in a school, you're deliberately making explicit some of those structural things within conversations and relationships. And I think the best schools and the best organisations have forgotten that they're restorative. The word doesn't appear in any documentation anywhere. It's just the way they are with each other in terms around honesty, relationships, diversity, equity, etc., inclusion. And I think that's part of the journey, that eventually the word disappears because it's who we are.
I can see you nodding there, Dorothy. Did you want to come in on that one?
No, not really, because my expertise is not psychology, right? But I think I want to come back to Terence's question around the bridge between social justice and restorative practices. And for people who know me, they know that this is significant for me, because I think, like, when I read that question, and I do think that this comes to Edward's question somewhat too, around what are the key psychological elements, like what are we asking in our questions, like what are we, what are the skills, what are the things that we need, and Chris, you alluded to this, or you were very direct in this, is who we are as human beings when we are in good relationship with each other. That's a restorative way of being. But what are we restoring? And I pointed to that in my presentation around, we're restoring when we have made the choice for to use another human being for our benefit. We're restoring that human being's dignity and worth. And so I know that there's a real aversion and avoidance of how do we of using the term justice. Okay, so I just quickly put this together. Like, what's the bridge between social justice and restorative practices? Justice. And when are we going to start talking about justice? Because that's what Black Lives Matter is about. They're saying, please see me as a human being. Indigenous cultures are saying, please see me as a human being. And they'll point to all kinds of experiences where those of us who are part of a dominant culture have made the decision to do something that dehumanizes them, right? So what is the bridge between social justice and restorative practices is reclaiming an understanding of the term, of the primary sense of what justice is, so that, we don't have a problem. We don't have a problem in schools or society talking about social justice as a way of being something that's for everybody's well-being. But as soon as we use the term restorative justice, everybody goes, oh, we can't use that term restorative justice because people aren't going to like it and people are going to misunderstand it. And I agree with that. There's been all kinds of misunderstanding around it. But I'm a proponent to say we have to reclaim that word justice if we are going to stop undermining the well-being of the marginalized in our communities. So, that's not the psychologist in me, that's the philosopher and theorist in me.
Thanks very much. Okay, we've reached the end of our time for questions, so I just want to thank everyone, thank the presenters again for the excellent presentations, and all of you for your questions. I'll hand back to Estelle or to Gillian.
Gillian first, and I'll say a couple of words to finish.
Okay, I am going to be brief. I was asked to do that impossible task of saying what if there were 3 key messages, that magic number 3 key messages from our seminar today. And this is my go at it, because this isn't easy. I think there are 3 things that we do all have in common, although they are expressed in different ways and manifest in different ways. It's a reminder of our need for common principles and values in working restoratively. And I think they focus on our sense of common humanity, our belief in human dignity, and a commitment to justice, to fairness, but to justice. And I think I am thinking of what Dorothy just said so powerfully. And finally, that bit of principle that is about a belief in the capacity for change. So that's the first one, a reminder of our common principles and values. There are things that bind us together. It's recognising that and making it explicit. I think the other thing that's come through really strongly is that we have been talking about the need for transformative action rather than the more diluted version, the affirmative kind of restorative practice, to go back to the terms that were used earlier on this afternoon. And thirdly and finally, I would say that the examples from Scotland and Finland show that when you have some kind of investment in something like mediation or in working restoratively and a commitment to inclusion at a kind of political or social level, you know, if you've got something that drives restorative change, then it helps the whole thing become more effective. And I think that's probably what Chris is struggling with in the English context, is the vacuum or the things that are actually pushing against that politically. Whereas although Finland and Scotland are really different, I think we have that in common. So that's the three things that I notice, three things to think about, three messages. Thanks.
Thank you, Gillian. It has been a long day. For some of us, we already had meeting this morning. A long afternoon, but a very rich one, very stimulating, very informative. Someone called it disruptive, but I think it was positive. So thank you so much to our four speakers, Dorothy and Maya, Gillian and Chris. Thank you so much to our audience. You know, you've all made this a rich experience for all, and I really think that, you know, it goes together. It's one cannot be without the others. I'll thank my co-chairs with whom we've been working hard to put this together, and I think it's been a nice experience to do this as always together. If you're interested, you live in Scotland, you are interested in research on Scotland and RJ, of course, you're very happy to contact us to join the network. If you are interested in the next webinar, which most probably will be a webinar, but this time more on criminal justice, you are welcome to also contact us, and we can then send you on details of that when they are available. I think I'll finish by just wishing you all a very good evening, and or whatever time it is where you are, and hope to see you all very soon. Stay safe and talk to you all soon. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.